a job well done. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
I call Dr Megan Woods.
Speaker, Labor is supporting this bill. We are doing it because we think it does some useful administrative things. We think that it makes two changes to the student loan scheme. First, it broadens the definition of income, and we think that this is actually quite a useful administrative change, because what it does is it broadens this definition to include incomes from trusts, companies, superannuation schemes, etc., as well as income. And we think this actually is quite a useful thing to do, because what it does is it does mean that the borrower's repayments will be based on their whole income and not just the income received from wages. The second thing that this bill does, and I am talking about very small things, the second change that it makes is to allow information sharing between customs and the IRD, so that IRD can have access to the contact details of overseas-based borrowers who are in serious default. So Labor is supporting it because we think that that these small changes will make the bill fairer, but we are not supporting the amendment which ended up at the Select Committee of Clause 39.4, which gave the Minister power to make regulations in order to smooth the transition of the bill. We are not supporting this clause of the bill because we think that it gives the Minister unnecessary power and it lacks the transparency needed for borrowers to have surety of where they are at. So what we have, and my colleague before me alluded to some of this, is we have a bill that does some very small tinkering around the edges. We don't have a bill that either addresses the big issues of the day or indeed even addresses the big issues of the need for student support. Because, Mr Speaker, there are some very real issues that we need to address on the issue of student support, and that we think that it fails to address these. We think that we need more people in tertiary education with qualifications that are about making New Zealand a better place if we are to succeed. And what we're doing in this bill does absolutely nothing to address these issues. So if we start with what it's not doing in terms of the big issues of the day, because actually there are some connections to it, and my colleague did allude to some of these, we have an economy that is in serious trouble. We have a serious number of people leaving our country, and in particular young people, and what this bill does is nothing to support them doing it. Labor has consistently supported many efforts to improve the repayment of debt from overseas-based borrowers, but we did not support the government's last major change, which cut the repayment holiday for overseas-based borrowers from 3 years to 1. And there was a very good reason why we did not support this. We thought that the cutting of the repayment holiday by the government made no sense at all. And it wasn't just Labor that thought that. In fact, advice from both the Treasury and the Ministry of Education said that it wouldn't make a blind bit of difference in terms of repayments. In fact, it was likely to increase the debt held by overseas borrowers, because what happened is that people actually just gave up trying to pay their loans without that 3-year repayment holiday there. All Labor is asking for is that we have some fairness and some equity with our student loan system. That we had the previous National Speaker tell us that this was about using government money, using it better to support students, but unfortunately that's not the case, because what we have standing is the attacks that we've had from National over the last 4 years on student support standing. And if we just run through these and see that none of the measures in this bill that we have before us will do anything to address those. So we had National that cut the eligibility of student allowance, that we had, not student allowance, that people aged over 55 couldn't access the student loan. They couldn't borrow. Now, in Labor, we actually don't think that it's particularly fair that you'd say to someone who reached the age of 55 and wanted to either continue their studies or retrain and say, no, that we're not even going to give you the chance to borrow that money. So when we hear the rhetoric a bit from the benches opposite about paying it back and how people need to take responsibility, this is a government that won't even give those aged over 55 the opportunity to do that. And we certainly didn't see that as a better use of our education budget. Part-time students, the way in which many people re-entering tertiary education, no longer allowed to borrow for their course-related costs as of budget 2010. For many people who are retraining or come from a background where tertiary education isn't their natural progression, part-time access to tertiary education is vital. And to be able to access the element of the loan where you can borrow for your course-related costs, which are absolutely essential for many of these courses, is something that is not a better use of the money. Budget 2010 also imposed a 2-year stand-down on new residents accessing the student loan scheme. So that what we said to people coming into New Zealand who came here to make their life here, that they couldn't access the loan, that we didn't back them into higher education, we didn't back these people into getting tertiary qualifications, and we didn't back their upskilling. And what that does, and what we think that this government is failing to do in this piece of legislation and what they did with this change, is it fails to seize the opportunity that tertiary education can give us in turning our country around. But I think perhaps the most short-sighted measure that this government has done in terms of tertiary support, and one of which this bill does absolutely nothing to address, was last year's budget announcement and what we've been living with for a year now. And we have students all over the country, or potential students all over the country, making decisions based on this as they cut the allowances for those doing postgraduate study. So what we have is a government that talks very big on innovation. We have a government that talks very big about the role of research in our economy. We have a government that talks big about the need and the place of this. But what we saw in the budget last year was a government that would not back our young people to get the qualifications necessary to be part of that future for New Zealand. They said, you know what, we don't value postgraduate education, that we don't think this is something that we think there's sufficient good for us as a nation in for us to pay you an allowance. And this is not something that Labor sees as sustainable. We think if you're going to address the issue of student support, which is what this bill before us does, you absolutely have to address that issue of allowances in postgraduate education. That this is the place. Anyone will tell you that the ideas machines in so many labs and so many groups around the country are indeed our postgrad students, whether that be at masters or at PhD level, that this is so crucial to our future and our innovation-led future that we just can't ignore that. So these are some of the things that we are absolutely not seeing in the bill that we have before us, and we think that it is a real lost opportunity that we have there. That what we're seeing is a piece of legislation that is not going to increase participation in tertiary education. That what we would rather see than piecemeal and small administrative changes like we're seeing in this piece of legislation before us, is an overview review of the scheme to ensure there's a fair approach and that people that need the support they need in continuing and participating in tertiary education can get that support. Tertiary education is not something that we can just tinker around the edges. When we introduced a user pays education system in this country, the loan scheme was put there to ensure that people did have access to it. What we see is actually growing inequalities under the present loan scheme. We see that people, because of age, because of the type of study, because of their time in New Zealand, do not have access to this loan scheme, and this does not address the issues of equity that the loan scheme was initially put in place to see. So, Mr Speaker, Labor supports this bill. It supports the small administrative changes that are contained in this bill. As I mentioned at the beginning of my speech, it does not support the the powers given to the Minister to make regulation under this, but what we would like to see is a broader review of the student loan scheme.
I call Holly Walker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Green Party will continue to oppose this Student Loan Scheme Amendment Bill number 2, as we did at the first reading. Mr Speaker, in our view, this bill is part of a gradual process of tinkering with the student loan scheme through a series of amendments, all of